Chief Olanrewaju Adegbite, the towering figure behind Adegbite Holdings, was a man of numbers, not nostalgia. He calculated profit margins faster than most men could blink and gave speeches that moved economies, not emotions. At nearly 60, his legacy stretched across real estate, oil, and telecommunications, with towering glass offices bearing his name in Lagos, Abuja, and Accra. But behind all the layers of prestige and status, there was a mother, a fading memory now trapped. In silence, motionless inside a sprawling Ikoyi mansion she no longer recognized, Madame Felicia Adegbite had once been the heart of every room she entered. In her youth, she was known as the high-life queen of Onitsha, a performer with unmatched elegance and a voice that melted hearts like hot palm oil. But time and a brutal stroke had robbed her of voice, grace, and movement. Now she lay confined to a reclining medical bed inside the east wing of her son's estate, where marble tiles gleamed and nurses tiptoed, but love rarely entered. Olanrewaju, who had once clung to her wrapper hem as a child, now managed her existence with the cold detachment he reserved for defunct board members. He didn't move her into his home, didn't sit by her bedside, didn't play her music. Instead, he installed a private medical suite, equipped it with silent machines that blinked and beeped, and left instructions with the estate manager that nothing should be lacking, except himself. The nurses came and went, each lasting only as long as their routines didn't conflict with the delicate pride of the household. Then came the suggestion from the estate manager. Perhaps what Madame Felicia needed was not another certified nurse, but a consistent companion. Someone who wouldn't treat her like a patient, but like a human being. Reluctantly, Olanrewaju approved the hiring of a live-in maid. He never met her, didn't ask for her credentials, only received a short message from his assistant. Her name was Ijoma, and she would begin that Monday. The name didn't stir anything in him. It was ordinary, unmemorable. But Ijoma's arrival changed the atmosphere in silent, invisible ways. She didn't wear crisp uniforms or carry a clipboard. She moved softly, with folded headscarves and worn slippers, greeting each corner of the house like it was sacred ground. She didn't speak loudly or ask many questions. Her world existed, within the walls of Madame Felicia's room, where she swept, bathed, adjusted, and arranged. No fanfare, no complaints. Olanrewaju, as usual, remained removed. His world was filled with executive meetings, estate acquisitions, and political negotiations. He never crossed paths with Ijoma, never peeked inside his mother's room, never paused to ask about her progress. But there was one thing he did do. He had surveillance installed, not for safety, but for suspicion. Discreet micro-cameras embedded inside air vents, behind decorative photo frames, tucked above doorways. He justified it by saying that trust was expensive, and in his line of work, no one earned it freely. For weeks, he ignored the camera feeds. But one humid Thursday night, after a draining board meeting and 2 glasses of imported gin, he remembered the footage. With a click of his mouse and a sigh, he opened the first clip, expecting negligence, maybe laziness. Instead, what greeted him was something entirely different. The room was dim, bathed in the soft glow of a reading lamp. Madame Felicia lay asleep, her body still, machines humming gently beside her. Ijoma sat near her, not on a maid's stool, but cross-legged on the floor, holding a faded hymn book in her lap. Her voice was barely audible, but each word came with a gentle rhythm that moved like slow river water. Olanrewaju leaned closer to the screen. He hadn't heard hymns like that in years. Then came another clip. This time Ijoma brushing his mother's hair, slowly, with a wooden comb dipped in shea butter. She wasn't rushed. She wasn't performing. Her movements were like prayer. In the background, high-life music played, faintly from an old speaker, one of Madame Felicia's original recordings. Olanrewaju blinked. He remembered that song. He remembered dancing to it in the garden of their old compound while his mother clapped and laughed. Now here it was again, resurrected in a quiet room, in the hands of a stranger. Another video loaded. Ijoma sat on the edge of the bed, folding small paper birds and placing them on the nightstand. Paper birds. Olanrewaju's throat tightened. His mother used to make them when she was anxious, delicate origami creatures folded with trembling hands. He had forgotten about them entirely. But someone hadn't. Someone had brought them back, and not by accident. In a fourth clip, Madame Felicia whimpered in her sleep, her hands twitching. Ijoma leaned over and stroked her forehead, whispering something inaudible, something that calmed her instantly. The old woman's body relaxed. Her face softened. Olanrewaju sat motionless for minutes after the footage ended. The ice in his glass had melted. The gin remained untouched. That night, he reviewed days' worth of footage. He saw Ijoma lighting candles, adjusting pillows, warming agbo for Madame Felicia's legs, humming lullabies, washing bedsheets with her own hands, and placing fresh hibiscus flowers beside the window. He saw something he hadn't expected to find in all the wealth he had accumulated: compassion. And not the kind that sought recognition, but the kind that healed. Ijoma had entered the mansion with nothing but her wrapper and her silence. Yet she had managed to touch a soul the machines and money could not reach. Olanrewaju leaned back in his leather chair and stared at the dark ceiling above. He did not know this woman, and yet she seemed to know his mother in ways he never, and a question burned in his chest. Who was she really, and why did she care so much? The next morning arrived with the usual filtered sunlight creeping through the linen blinds of Chief Olanrewaju's study. But the world outside felt dull compared to the storm of thoughts rising within him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about balance sheets, policy meetings, or investment figures. He was thinking about his mother. Not the woman who smiled beside him in press photos at gala nights, but the woman who once wrapped fish in plantain leaves with bare hands and danced barefoot to her own voice on the gramophone. That woman had been silent for so long he'd almost buried her in his mind, yet Ijoma had unearthed fragments of her in just weeks. Olanrewaju postponed his first 3 meetings and walked slowly toward the east wing, past polished marble corridors and tall ancestral paintings. The last time he had stepped into his mother's room had been months ago, and even then it had been brief and uncomfortable. Now, as he entered the quiet space, something felt changed. The air smelled faintly of mint and shea butter. The curtains had been tied with coral beads. A bowl of steaming yam porridge sat untouched beside a glass of warm zobo. Ijoma was there, placing fresh palm fronds in a vase near the window, her back straight, movements purposeful. She didn't look up immediately, but when she did, she stepped aside, offering space. Olanrewaju approached the bed. Madame Felicia lay there, her face calmer, her cheeks less sunken. Her eyes opened slowly and locked with his. She did not flinch. She did not blink away. For the first time in years, she simply looked at him, as if seeing her son not as a man of empires, but as a boy who used to cling to her wrapper. Later that evening, Olanrewaju couldn't shake the need to know more. He opened his private archive, tracing old employment records. Ijoma's file was thin. No formal address, just a name, date, of birth, and a reference handwritten in ink. No photo. He called his estate manager discreetly, asking how she'd been found. The reply was vague. She came recommended from a retired matron who had worked with several elite homes in Anambra. There were no complaints. She had simply appeared when needed, filled a role with silence and grace, and now occupied the center of the one relationship Olanrewaju had always mishandled. He returned to his screen again that night, poring through new footage. This time, he focused not on the actions, but the atmosphere. He noticed how Ijoma folded towels with the same precision his childhood nanny once did. He noticed how she sang Nara Ekelemo during bath time, a song he hadn't heard since his primary school years. Something kept itching in his chest, a feeling too strange to name. The truth began knocking in whispers. On the fourth night, unable to ignore it anymore, he reviewed older family photos stored deep in digital archives, images of birthdays, holidays, dusty childhood years. One photo caught his eye. He was maybe 9. His father was absent as usual, but his mother was smiling, one of her rare, unguarded smiles, and beside her stood a woman in plain Ankara, holding a tray with drinks. That was Nkechi, their maid from his early years. She had worked in the house for over 6 years and disappeared abruptly after an incident no one spoke about again. Olanrewaju barely remembered the details, only the tension, the accusations, his mother's sharp voice and the sudden silence that followed. His mother had claimed a necklace had gone missing. No police were involved, no investigation. Just one day, Nkechi was gone, and the family moved on like she'd never existed. He squinted at the woman in the photo, and then something clicked. The way she tied her scarf, the tilt of her head, the sharp but soft features, it was all too familiar. Olanrewaju leaned back slowly, his throat dry. Could it be? Could Ijoma be her daughter? The timing matched, the face matched, the mannerisms, the voice. Everything felt like an echo. He suddenly felt ashamed, not just because of what happened to Nkechi, but because he had allowed so much of his past to become shadows. He had never asked questions, never demanded fairness. He simply accepted what his mother had said and never gave it another thought. If Ijoma truly was Nkechi's daughter, then her return wasn't coincidence, it was destiny. But what baffled him more was not her presence, but her purpose. She had come into his mother's life without a trace of revenge. No bitterness. No sabotage. Just kindness. She had entered the house of the woman who destroyed her mother's life and offered her peace. Olanrewaju found sleep impossible that night. He watched the last footage again, the one where his mother had a night terror. He saw Ijoma run to her, soothe her, and wrap her frail body in a warm blanket. No hesitation, no fury, just care. He remembered the last time he had tried to hold his mother's hand. She had recoiled. But now, with Ijoma around, she welcomed it. She whispered his name. She responded to his presence. He had tried with wealth, with specialists, with luxury. But it was this woman in plain wrappers who had reached her soul, and the weight of that truth pressed hard against his chest. The next morning, he did something he had never done before. He rose early, left his phone behind, and walked into the kitchen. He made tea, awkwardly but determined, and carried it himself to the east wing. Ijoma was already there, cleaning. He placed the tray on the side table. His mother stirred, looked at him, then pointed weakly at the window. The sun was rising, golden across the bougainvillea. Ijoma smiled faintly and opened the curtains, wider. And in that moment, as the light spilled into the room, Olanrewaju knew one thing with unshakable certainty. The truth about Ijoma mattered more than the lies of the past. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance a billionaire can receive isn't gold but grace. The sun had not fully risen when Olanrewaju found himself sitting in the garden outside his mother's room. The same garden where decades ago he had chased dragonflies and tripped over his own feet, laughing with a freedom he hadn't known in years. The flowers had changed, the gardener was long gone, but the memory lingered. It was there, in that garden, that he decided to confront the past, not with hostility or guilt, but with a desire to understand what he had allowed himself to forget. He began with old employment ledgers, tracing the names of staff who had once served in his father's compound in Ibadan and later in their Ikoyi estate. Nkechi Okoye appeared in bold handwriting across several records: laundry logs, kitchen reports, guest services. always punctual, never absent. Her service lasted over 6 years, but then came the abrupt end, written in a different hand. Terminated. No explanation, no appeal. Just silence. Olanrewaju sat back and stared at the ink that ended her employment. It matched the memory of a single afternoon when a gold necklace went missing. He remembered shouting, but not from Nkichi. It came from his mother. The shame, the abrupt dismissal, the way Nkichi had carried her bag without looking anyone in, the eye. And then nothing. Her name was never mentioned again. Until now, Olanrewaju summoned one of his senior staff and instructed them to discreetly investigate where Nkichi's family had settled after she left Lagos. What returned to him days later was a file with little detail, but a clear answer. Nkichi had returned to her hometown in Niue, where she died 10 years ago of a prolonged illness. She never remarried. She raised one daughter. Her name, Ijoma. The confirmation sat on his desk like a quiet indictment. The woman he had hired to serve his mother, the one who now bathed her, fed her, and healed her spirit, was the daughter of the very woman they had once disgraced without a word of justice. But what pierced him more was that Ijoma had never mentioned it. She had said nothing. She had done nothing to draw attention to herself. Instead, she had worked quietly, pouring love into the very house that had failed her bloodline. Olanrewaju couldn't speak of it to anyone. He carried the knowledge in silence like a private scar. Each time he entered his mother's room, he saw Ijoma differently. Not as a maid, not even as a caregiver, but as a symbol of what his family had ignored. Integrity that required no applause. Madame Felicia, though still frail, had begun responding more often. Her words came in fragments, sometimes names, sometimes songs. She smiled occasionally. She gripped his hand with more strength. Her eyes began to follow movement. Olanrewaju knew that while the machines measured her vitals, it was Ijoma's presence that measured her peace. One afternoon, as the breeze filtered through the curtains and a distant choir sang from a neighboring compound, he watched his mother attempt to hum along. Her voice was dry, broken, but it was sound. Ijoma didn't interrupt. She simply closed her eyes and joined in softly, as if honoring a sacred bond. Olanrewaju felt his throat tighten. He hadn't prayed in years, but in that moment, he bowed his head and thanked God for a second chance. Driven by a newfound need to correct old wrongs, Olanrewaju began reviewing not just his mother's history with staff, but his entire household's past. He traced files from former cooks, drivers, gardeners. What he found made his stomach turn. At least 4 staff had been dismissed over the years without fair hearing, all accused of minor thefts with no police reports, no internal investigations, no voices raised in their defense. Some had served for over a decade. Their names were forgotten, their stories buried. It had always been his mother's word, and his silence. That silence now felt like complicity. Determined to do more than just feel guilt, he contacted his legal team and instructed the creation of a fund, not just a donation, something structured, something long-lasting. It would be called the Nkichi Initiative, a trust dedicated to offering legal support, vocational scholarships, and emotional counseling to domestic workers who had been unfairly treated or wrongfully accused. He didn't announce it in newspapers. He didn't tweet about it. He simply funded it quietly and handed administrative oversight to an independent board. But he kept one role reserved: ambassador. That title, he insisted, would belong to Ijoma. When he told her, she said nothing at first. She simply nodded and returned to folding linen in the corridor. That night, Olanrewaju watched her through the monitor one more time, not out of suspicion, but reverence. She was braiding his mother's hair under the soft light of a bedside lamp. Her fingers moved gently, as though she was weaving forgiveness into every strand. His mother didn't wince. She sat there, eyes half closed, peaceful. A woman once feared for her pride was now cherished in humility, and the one who had every right to be bitter chose love instead. Olanrewaju closed the laptop, placed it gently on his desk, and walked to the garden. The moon was rising, the wind was cool. He looked up and said a quiet prayer, not for business, not for power, but for grace. Because in Ijeoma, he had seen what money could never teach, a quiet strength born from wounds, a dignity carved from injustice, and a love that chose healing over hate. The days that followed moved like pages in an old journal, quiet and heavy with reflection. Olanrewaju's schedule, once overflowing with international meetings and elite social engagements, gradually made space for something far more grounding. Each morning, he would walk into his mother's room, not out of duty but desire. He would sit beside her, read softly from her favorite hymn book, or sometimes simply hold her hand and watch as the garden bathed in morning light. Her eyes, still, dimmed by age, seemed to recognize him now, not as the boy who grew into a distant tycoon, but as the son she once rocked to sleep with lullabies under a leaking zinc roof in Ibadan. There were no grand breakthroughs, no miraculous recoveries, but there was presence, and sometimes that was enough. Ijeoma remained as constant as ever. She did not change her tone, her routine, or her posture despite the unfolding revelations around her. She continued to treat Madame Felicia with grace, feeding her slowly, massaging her tired legs, brushing her hair with an intimacy that surpassed professional duty. The garden became their shared sanctuary. On days when the weather permitted, Ijeoma would wheel Madame Felicia out to sit under the orange tree, the same tree under which Olanrewaju had buried his childhood dog decades ago. It was there that the silence between mother and son began to break. Felicia would hum faint tunes as Ijeoma played recordings of her old high-life songs, and once in a while, her hand would reach out to pat her son's knee, fragile but full of intent. Olanrewaju began inviting old estate workers back, not to interrogate them, but to listen. Stories emerged, stories he had never heard because he had never cared to ask. One former cook recounted how Nkechi had once stayed overnight to care for Felicia after a surgical procedure, unpaid, unasked. Another remembered how Nkechi had been, the one who used to tuck young Olanrewaju into bed when Felicia was away at performances. Piece by piece, the puzzle of the past reassembled itself. The woman accused of theft had been a silent pillar in his formative years, dismissed like discarded paper without a moment's pause. And now, her daughter had returned, not with bitterness or vengeance, but with hands that healed what had been broken. When the official launch of the Nkechi initiative was announced, Olanrewaju ensured that it would be modest, local, and deeply intentional. No fanfare, no politicians. Just a quiet gathering of families, social workers, and former domestic staff. The venue was a community hall in Surulere, repurposed with flowers and simple chairs. Ijeoma, dressed in a navy blue wrapper with golden embroidery, stood before the crowd as the keynote speaker. Her voice did not waver. She spoke of her mother, not with tears, but with honor. She spoke of redemption, not as revenge, but as the long road back to dignity. She ended with words that silenced the room. Redemption is not saying sorry. It is rebuilding what you helped destroy. The hall rose in thunderous applause, not for a speech well delivered, but for a truth long buried and now fully seen. In the weeks that followed, the foundation received calls from across the country, maids, gatemen, drivers, men and women who had been dismissed without justice, many of whom never dared to hope for vindication. Some of their stories were heartbreaking, some were unbelievable, but now they had a voice and a place. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Madame Felicia's health began its final descent. Her body weakened, her appetite faded, and her moments of lucidity came and went like coastal winds. But she remained peaceful, surrounded not by strangers in lab coats, but by people who truly cared. On her final morning, the sky was pale grey, the rain light and constant. Ijoma sat on one side of the bed, Olanrewaju on the other. Felicia opened her eyes briefly, turned her head toward her son, and whispered 3 words that would stay with him forever. "You came back." She closed her eyes and never opened them again. The burial was private, attended by close family, a few former staff, and members of the foundation. Olanrewaju did not wear the mask of a grieving billionaire. He stood at her grave as a son, stripped of pretense, holding Ijoma's hand as the final dust fell over the casket. There were no long speeches, no television cameras, only silence. Only healing. In the months that followed, Ijoma remained on the estate, not as a maid, but as the lead coordinator for the Foundation's outreach program. She oversaw scholarships, processed wrongful dismissal claims, and mentored young women entering domestic service with dignity. The house no longer echoed with coldness. It had become a space of restoration. Olanrewaju no longer needed surveillance, cameras to monitor his home. What needed watching now was his own heart. A heart that had once grown calloused from power, but had softened through the quiet persistence of one woman who chose love over hate. And so, the story of a billionaire who hired a maid to serve his dying mother did not end with wealth, nor did it end with power. It ended with truth. The kind of truth that does not scream but hums gently in the hands of those who choose mercy. Ijoma had come into the mansion with the blood of a forgotten servant and left as the heartbeat of a transformed home. Olanrewaju, once feared for his empire, would be remembered not for his money, but for the day he sat beside a woman he had never truly known, held her hand as she faded, and whispered the most honest words he had ever said. "I'm sorry it took so long." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring more heartfelt stories to life, one soul at a time. Please subscribe the Folkteller Bae